So a few weeks ago, we compared the JBL Boombox to the new UE Hyperboom, and the Hyperboom came out the winner in that matchup. But today, we have a rematch because we're going to be comparing the Hyperboom to the new JBL Boombox 2. So, let's see how these two large portable Bluetooth speakers stack up against one another, and finally crown a definitive winner. Now, as always, let's address price first. The UE Hyperboom has a retail price of $400, whereas the JBL Boombox 2 has a retail price of $500. So obviously there's a $100 price difference between these two speakers, and that can definitely be a differentiating factor for a lot of people. So, if you want to pick either of these speakers up, they'll be linked down below. And if you want to learn more about either of these speakers, please watch their full reviews, because we're only going to be going over their main differences. Okay, but now let's address the designs of these speakers. Both of these speakers are great portable speakers because they both have built-in carrying handles. They're both relatively lightweight because they both weigh in at 13 pounds. They both have mostly fabric bodies so they can stand up to constant bumps and scrapes, and they both aren't afraid of a little bit of water. So if either of these speakers get a drink spilled on them, or if they get caught on the rain, they'll be perfectly fine. But personally, I do prefer the Hyperboom's vertical orientation over the Boombox 2's horizontal orientation, because I've noticed that it's much easier to place the Hyperboom around the house or on a table, because it takes up significantly less surface area. So the Hyperboom's vertical orientation just gives you way more freedom when it comes to placing your speaker around the house. Now, when it comes to tech specs, the Hyperboom is using Bluetooth 5.0, whereas the Boombox 2 is using Bluetooth 5.1. Now, ultimately, this doesn't really matter because both of these speakers can be connected to two Bluetooth devices at the same time, so you and a friend can both be DJ. And both of these speakers are strictly using SBC. Unfortunately, neither of these speakers support AAC or aptX. But I do want to point out that the Hyperboom has zero latency across the board whenever you try to watch movies or videos on your phone, whether you're using an iPhone or an Android device, which is definitely a good thing. Whereas the Boombox 2 does have a noticeable amount of latency across the board, whether you're using an iPhone or an Android device. Now, I rarely use either of these speakers to watch videos with, but I know some people do. Now, when it comes to ports, both of these speakers have an audio jack and they both have a USB-A out port so that you can charge your own devices. But I still wish that at least one of these speakers had a USB-C port because a lot of phones these days are starting to come included with USB-C cables. So I really feel that if either of these speakers had a USB-C port, they would have been future-proofed a little better. But the Hyperboom does have something that the Boombox 2 doesn't have, and that's a built-in optical port. So you can actually hook this speaker up to your TV or gaming console and use it as a soundbar. Because, you know, flat screen TVs these days just have awful sounding built-in speakers. So I really do think that the optical port on the Hyperboom gives it a lot of extra versatility, and it can also help justify this rather large purchase for someone who doesn't already have a soundbar. Because you can use the speaker to listen to music and you can also use it to watch TV. Which is actually what I've been doing during this whole quarantine, because surprisingly I don't have a soundbar in my room and I think I should probably get on that. Now, when it comes to battery life, both of these speakers have an advertised battery life of 24 hours, but those numbers are for when you're using these speakers at 50% volume. Real-world use with these speakers set at 80% volume, I've found that the Hyperboom is good for 8.5 hours of playback time, whereas the Boombox 2 is good for 7 hours of playback time. So overall, both of these speakers are good for a whole day of high volume listening. But during this whole quarantine, since I've been working out at home and I've been using these speakers while I work out, I've noticed that the Hyperboom does manage to outlast the Boombox 2. But now let's talk about listening to music with these speakers. The Boombox 2 has the same speaker setup as the original Boombox. You've got dual woofers on the front and dual tweeters, and you've also got those signature dual exposed passive radiators shooting out of the sides of the speaker. Whereas the Hyperboom also has a dual woofer and dual tweeter setup, but its passive radiators shoot out the back, which does give it an advantage. Now, also, keep in mind, the Boombox 2 now only has a single EQ setting, whereas the Hyperboom has a fully customizable EQ. But for this sound test, I'm going to be using the Hyperboom's stock EQ. And also, the sound test is going to be comparing the speakers at their max volumes, because ultimately I know that's what everyone is most curious about.
A pair of jeans, a shirt or two. We didn't pack as if we weren't going back. It doesn't matter if it's true. We got a feeling love will give us what we like. The world is waiting up. The world is waiting half a step beyond our door. Yeah. And if it's not enough, I wanna see the stuff the world has got in store. I wanna take it all in, I'm falling. The seascape by night, wanna catch in my photos. Where you go, every corner twice as bright. They'll be my treasures forever. When I can't hold you tight, I'll see the Stockholm lights. The Stockholm lights, the Stockholm lights. Tomorrow feels a year away, like the seconds, the beginning and the end. But if in time it's yesterday, your picture's gonna bring it home to me again. The world is waiting up. The world is waiting half a step beyond our door. And if it's not enough, I wanna see the stuff the world has got in store. I wanna take it all in, I'm falling. The seascape by night, wanna catch in my photos. Where you go, every corner twice as bright. They'll be my treasures forever. When I can't hold you tight, I'll see the Stockholm lights. The Stockholm lights, the Stockholm lights.
So first off, I want to point out that the Boombox 2's sound signature likes to put an emphasis on the mids and a little bit on the highs as well. So vocals are very pronounced, and it also seems like the Boombox 2 is louder than the Hyperboom. Whereas the Hyperboom's stock sound signature has a much more neutral sound to it, so the mids and highs aren't as pronounced, but more importantly, the Hyperboom sounds much warmer because it has significantly more bass than the Boombox 2. Personally, I think the Hyperboom sounds best with this stock EQ, but if you want to bring the mids and highs out a little bit, you can absolutely do that because the Hyperboom has a fully customizable EQ. Whereas with the Boombox 2, you're stuck with whatever JBL gives you. Now, from a performance standpoint, even though I just said that the Boombox 2 sounds louder than the Hyperboom because it puts an emphasis on the mids and highs, it's actually not, because you can clearly see that the Hyperboom manages to outperform the Boombox 2 here when they're both set at max volume. Now, one thing that you can do with the Boombox 2 to get a little bit more out of it is to use it while it's plugged in. And when you have the speaker plugged in, it manages to get a little louder and it gets a little bit more bass. But even when it's plugged in, the Boombox 2 still doesn't get as loud or put out as much physical bass as the Hyperboom when it's running off of its built-in battery. But something that I do have to point out here is that the Hyperboom doesn't get a performance boost when you have it plugged in like the Boombox 2 does. Now, I don't think that this is a good or a bad thing, but overall the Hyperboom does manage to get louder and have more physical bass than the Boombox 2, even when it's plugged in. And overall, I really do prefer to listen to music with the Hyperboom over the Boombox 2. My biggest problem with the Boombox 2 is that since it likes to put an emphasis on the mids and highs, it can get ear-piercing at higher volumes, and it can sound overly bright. Whereas with the Hyperboom, if you use it with this stock EQ, it just sounds way more natural. But the biggest reason why I love the Hyperboom is because it puts out a ton of physical bass, so you can really feel your music. Whereas with the Boombox and Boombox 2, both of these speakers really only increase their bass up until like 80 or 85% volume. And then from there on out, just the mids and highs are really getting increased. So at higher volumes, the Boombox 2 is blaring out a ton of mids and highs but sounds shallow because it doesn't have the bass to back it up. Now obviously it is putting out some bass, but it just doesn't match the loudness, if that makes any sense. So the Hyperboom is a straight up bass machine, but you can also easily amplify its bass by simply putting it up against the wall so that the bass has something to bounce off of. Now, unfortunately, you can't do this as easily with the Boombox 2 because its passive radiators shoot out its sides, so you're gonna have to find a corner that works. Whereas with the Hyperboom, since both of its passive radiators shoot out its back, any wall or surface will do. Oh, well, I got it. Now, one of the really cool things about the Hyperboom is that it has an adaptive EQ, kind of like the Apple HomePod. Now, what it does is that it keeps your music sounding good no matter where you place it. So, like I just said, if you were to place the Hyperboom up against a wall, you can amplify your bass. But having a ton of bass means absolutely nothing if you can't actually hear the rest of your music. So what the adaptive EQ does is that it'll automatically adjust your EQ so that you can still get a ton of bass, but everything else is still balanced and audible. Now, you can really tell when the adaptive EQ is working when you bring your speaker from the outdoors to indoors. When the Hyperboom detects that it's outdoors, it'll boost up its bass so that you're still getting a good amount of thump. But then when you bring the Hyperboom back inside, it'll sound muffled for a few seconds because the bass is turned all the way up. But once the speaker realizes that it's indoors, it'll even everything out again. So I really like that the Hyperboom has an adjustable EQ, so you can make it sound however you want, and I also really appreciate its adaptive EQ, because it keeps the speaker sounding great no matter where you place it. And I really wish the Boombox 2 had at least an adjustable EQ, because like I said earlier, its highs can get ear-piercing at times, specifically snare drums. But another feature that I really like about the Hyperboom is that you can also remotely power it on or off straight from its app. Now, it's not a huge deal that the Boombox 2 doesn't have this, but it does come in handy from time to time. Specifically for those times you might forget to turn off your speaker when it's in the other room. It's really for laziness, really. So overall, I think the clear winner here is the Hyperboom. From a performance standpoint, I highly prefer listening to the Hyperboom over the Boombox 2, because the sheer amount of bass this speaker is putting out makes listening to your music much more physical. And since the Hyperboom doesn't have the bright sound signature found on the Boombox 2, it doesn't get ear-piercing at higher volumes. Personally, during this whole quarantine, since I've been working out at home, I've been using both of these speakers in my home gym. And I couldn't wait to switch back to the Hyperboom because the Boombox 2 just sounds flat by comparison. But also, the Hyperboom also has all of these added benefits over the Boombox 2. It has an adjustable EQ, so you can make it sound however you want. Its adaptive EQ keeps the speaker sounding great whether you're using it indoors or outdoors. It has a slightly better battery life because I've noticed I've been able to go an extra workout in between charges with this speaker. You can hook it up to your TV, and I've also noticed that it's easier to place around the house because of its vertical orientation. And finally, there's the fact that the speaker costs $100 less than the Boombox 2, which is just the cherry on top. You can call me a Hyperboom fanboy all you want, but you're gonna have to pry my Hyperboom out of my cold dead hands. If you made it this far, I guess you enjoyed the video, so hit that like button and get subscribed. It helps out more than you realize. If you want to pick any of the products up mentioned in this video, those will be linked in the description down below, and you can also support the channel by checking out the merch store. But other than that, I'll catch you next time.